Today we're going to have a lesson on trills in music. It's an ornamentation in music lesson. I'll be doing a lot of these over the next little while. And this will be trills for any instrument, although of course I'll be demonstrating on the classical guitar today. One thing I'm going to recommend is go to the link in the description and visit my website where I have a large article on this, on trills. In the article, it's laid out very clearly, and there's going to be much more information in the actual article and lots of images of scores and things like that. So you want to go follow that link and make sure you see the actual article, because today's video is going to be just a very generalized overview for students at the beginner to intermediate level. But again, I'm not going to include everything in the article because it would make the video too long. So what is a trill? Well, you've probably heard trills before. Here's an example of a simple texture including trills. So those decorative ornaments, the kind of fluttering between two notes, is a trill. So a trill is a musical ornament that consists of a rapid alternation between two adjacent notes. The two notes that alternate are usually a semitone or tone away and are commonly diatonic or from the scale or key of the piece. So if in the music the written note is C, I'll probably ornament it with the D natural, either by starting with C, going to D and returning to C, or starting on the D and ending on the C. Trills start right on the beat of the music where they're written. And they were also known as a shake. That's a more common term in earlier time periods. But 20th century, they're kind of trills, and there's lots of definitions, but you can go to the website to see all of them. So there's really just two ways that we play trills on the guitar. Either we're going to play it on a single string, like that, or we're going to play it across strings. For example, if I was going from D sharp to E, we can do a cross string. So either on a single string or across two strings. So that's generally how we play them on the guitar. On other instruments like the keyboard, you really just have two keys that you're going to alternate between, so they don't necessarily have different ways they do it in terms of the functionality of the instrument. But on the guitar, we do have some different ways, and every instrument will have its own little style of how to play trills. So depending on what instrument you play, you want to really get into how it's done on your particular instrument. But I'll explore these on the guitar later. When we play them on a single string on the guitar, we do a hammer-on and pull-off, or ascending and descending slur. So if it's from the written note, we'll go hammer-on, pull-off, hammer-on, pull-off. If it's from the upper auxiliary, we'll go pull-off, hammer-on, pull-off. If we're doing just a little short trill. Trills can be of different lengths. But that's generally how you play them on the guitar. One more thing before we start talking about the context of trills is that trills always decorate the primary note. So when you have a primary note, whether you're starting on that note and decorating it, you always return to the primary written note. Even if you start on the note above, you always end on that primary note, so that the primary note is the most important one, and you always resolve to it. There can be some tension from the other note, but you always end up on the written note. So what do trills do to the music? This is the important discussion. Trills can provide a number of musical results. So they can be just purely decorative, so a fluttering rhythmic and melodic interest, or they can also have pretty intense effects on the harmony of the music. So they can make it quite dissonant and then improve the dissonance and resolution of the music. So there's this ornamental kind of decorative aspect of trills, and then there's this very functional aspect of trills. They serve a function in the music and harmony that really affects the music, and that's what we're really going to talk about today. So there's lots of different symbols for trills. You can check that out on the site. But they all usually mean the same thing. And one of the things you want to understand is that often trills are, improvised or just added. They're not set in stone. So sometimes, regardless of the symbol that you see, it could be any sort of trill. In early music and lute tablatures, sometimes they use symbols that would indicate any kind of ornament. So whether it was trill or not, you'd usually know by the context, though. But let's do some quick tips regarding learning trills before we start playing them and things like that. So the first thing is listen to lots of music from the time period and composer you're performing. That way you will hear how the trills should be performed. If you're playing Bach and it just doesn't seem to sound right starting on the written note, maybe starting on the upper auxiliary will be more appropriate. There are music theory courses you can take and music history, but of course, just listening to the music, absorbing the style naturally will be very important. If you know that and you're listening to lots of historical players, you'll know how it sounds and you'll be able to hear what's appropriate. So that's a really good thing for students to do, is just listen to more music by historical and modern performers. Of course, research the musical era, genre, style, so you know more about what type of ornamentation they used. You want to remember that trills are decorative, but they also have a function. So you should always play your music without the trill to understand the written primary notes, and then add the trill afterwards to see how it affects the music. Now, that's a really important fact, is that the primary notes are more important than the ornament itself, unless you're using it in a real functional way. Trills are often added at the discretion of the performer, so you can add them a lot especially in Renaissance and Baroque music. You can add trills all over the place, but again, you want to understand how they affect the music. Maintain the rhythm. When you're doing these things, 3, 4, 1, 2. You want to make sure that your beat structure remains very intact when you're playing trills, so that your trill isn't ruining any primary musical elements. If you're ruining primary musical elements because you want to get a trill in there, that's a real fail, because the trill, it just ornaments the actual structure of the music. It's like a Christmas tree. You put ornaments on it. It's still a tree, it still has the branches, but you're just decorating it a little bit. You're not altering the tree itself. Don't overthink the rhythm necessarily. A lot of trills are based on musical instinct from your listening experience and your technique, but there's a certain amount of rubato in trills that you'll hear from lots of performers, so it's hard to nail it down as a specific rhythm. So if you're asking your teachers, what rhythm is it exactly? It's not always that kind of situation. We can get pretty close sometimes if we're being specific, but it's by musical instinct often. Last thing is, a little bit of music theory can go a long way in deciding when to add trills and what type of trill to add. For example, when there's a suspension in music and the previous note is D, and the trilled note is C coming up next, that D that you just played can serve as a suspension over the bar. If you don't know what a suspension is, that's okay. In the article, I recommend some music theory books that you can check out to start learning some of that material. So diving into performance practice and historical materials can be so interesting and fun to do. You can read lots of source material that talks about trills and talks about all sorts of musical ideas, and it's so interesting to hear it. I'll list a bunch of resource books on the site, so you can maybe purchase some books. But here's a quote from Jean-Baptiste Bissard, who's a Renaissance composer and a lute player. And here he talks about the difficulty of notating ornaments. So this is a quotation from him. "You should have some rules for the sweet relishes and shakes, trills, if they could be expressed here as they are on the lute. But seeing as they cannot be expressed by speech or writing, thou wert best to imitate some cunning player, or get them by thy own practice." So to listen to good players, or to get it from experimenting, right? "Only take heed, lest in making too many shakes thou hinder the perfection of the notes." So unless you're messing with the actual primary written notes in the structure. In some, if you affect biting sounds, as some men call them, which may very well be used, yet use them not in your running division playing, and use them not at all, but when you judge them decent. So that's a really interesting quotation from the Renaissance, where the composer is actually talking about, like, yes, use trills, but not if you start to infringe on the perfection of the written notes or the structure of the piece or the structure of the beat. There's a lot to that, and that's so good to hear, because it means that in the Renaissance, at least with this particular quote, they are not suggesting that you can just use them and mess with the rhythm and use tons of rubato. No, the perfection of the notes was there, and you're just decorating a little bit with your trills as long as you deem it decent. Okay, let's start talking about trills themselves. Trills can be any length that you need them to be. They can be very short. If you have a quarter note trill, you could just play 16th notes. 2, 3. Here I'm starting on the upper note, so the written note is C, but I'm starting on the D, and we're going to talk about that discussion in a bit. You can practice them really rhythmic like this, but you could also shorten that up and have the final resolution of C be longer, for example. Still the same number of repetitions, but nevertheless, you're having more time on the final note. You can go much faster, which again elongates the C at the end. You can have more repetitions. You know, there's all sorts of things. But the thing is, when you're listening to music, you'll often hear performers, for example, elongate the first note and then accelerando and then end up with a sustained note. So there we go. We have like a long first note and then a flurry of other notes. So it's based on the musical context and what sounds appropriate in that particular piece of music and the time period and the composer. There's all these variables that happen. So let's start talking about some of the other trills we can discuss and variables as we go. But here's a written example in a simple texture. Here's the original. Here's a trill starting on the upper note. 1, 2, 3. Or if we started on the written note, we'll discuss more of this in a bit. Just listen for now. Here's the original. So that's starting on the written note. So trills can sound different based on what note you start on, right? One little tiny guitar tidbit is that sometimes in certain textures we do a cross-string trill, which is not often done in early music on lutes and things like that, but we do it on guitar. So for example, if I have a B chord, and I'm playing B and D sharp, and I don't want to do the trill with my fourth finger because it's awkward or because I'm holding other notes and I can't do that, then we'll use an adjacent string. And in a cross-string trill, we're still doing E, D sharp, but using a different string to actually accomplish that. So in my fingering for cross-string trills is usually A, M, I, P, A, M, I, P, E, D sharp, and then I mute that E when I stop, because we want the primary written note to sustain at the end. So there's always a primary written note that gets sustained at the end. If I don't mute that note, then we just get like this real dissonance, right? Which we don't want. So that's why I was muting it with my finger afterwards. You can do cross-string trills from the written note as well. Same effect. Should probably mute the top string when I do that. So let's move on and learn more about trills. So you now know that trills can start on either the written note or the upper auxiliary, the note above in the scale. Usually it can be a chromatic note, but usually it's from the key. So it all depends on the musical context, time period, geographic location, and the specific composers, whether the note starts on the written note or the note above. But there are some generalizations that you can follow. For example, in the Baroque era, especially around cadences, we often will start the trill on the upper auxiliary, the upper note. And quite often in the Romantic era, we start from the written pitch. Quite often in the Renaissance, we'll start from the written pitch too. But these are all generalizations, and they're useful. That's fine to start with generalizations. When you're playing Baroque music, start from the note above. That'll serve you very well. But you have to remember that music is flexible and diverse. So you need to research the composer and the historical situation and the functional preference of the trill. So let's talk about starting on the upper auxiliary, which is a really common way to do a trill in, for example, the Baroque era. One thing you want to understand is when you start from the note above, you are adding a non-chord tone to the chord. So if I have this B chord, and I add this E into it, do you hear how dissonant that is? That minor second is very dissonant. So by adding that note, if I start on that note on the accented beat, and then resolve it to the actual note that's part of the chord. So in this case, the note that's part of the chord is D sharp. Sounds nice in there. And then I can start the trill on the E, end on the D sharp. I get some tension followed by resolution because we have a non-chord tone on the beat, on that accented beat, and then we resolve it to the note that is part of the chord. So you don't have to know all of the theory behind it. For example, in cadences, the 5 chord, that dominant to tonic relationship, the 5 chord going to the 1 chord. Quite often that 5 chord is considered tension because the 5 chord has this like tension to it, and then it resolves, for 5, 1, tension, release, or resolution. So we have this tension and resolution situation. You don't have to know all the music theory, just like tension and resolution. And by adding this trill into the mix, we are actually increasing the tension of that chord before its resolution. So starting from the upper auxiliary has a harmonic function on the music. It increases the tension and dissonance of the situation and then resolves it usually. So that's why the starting on the upper auxiliary, the upper note, is so common at cadences because we have this tension and resolution situation. So that's a really important fact. That changes the music a little bit. It makes the music more intense. It changes or encourages the original intentions of the composer. We are helping the composer create more tension in that area where they have indicated tension already. When you start on the written note, you are not doing that as much because on the actual written note, you have a chord tone on the beat, on that accented beat. You have the note that's part of the chord, and so there's no resolution needed. You're just decorating it with a little bit of dissonance for a second and then returning. But there's no harsh dissonance on the beat, and so therefore starting on the written note is much more of a decorative effect and much more of a fluttering. It doesn't interfere with the harmony very much. So it doesn't help with the tension and resolution aspect. So there's lots of historical and musical context involved when deciding on these things, and music theory helps. But one interesting thing is that there's these generalizations that we have about ornamentation have really become like a bit of an issue because people will apply it without ever researching further. For example, Bach's ornamentation chart. People will say, like, in the Baroque period, you start your trills from the upper auxiliary. They'll just say that as a blanket statement, and they're like very serious that like that's the way it's done in the Baroque era. That's a great generalization for students, and for the most part, it's probably helpful. But the issue is that it's not always true. For example, yes, in Bach's keyboard music, at his cadences, you probably want to start from the upper auxiliary. But what if we go over to Spain, to the Baroque guitar? What did Sands do? Well, there's plenty of evidence that Sands actually preferred starting from the written note for his trills, especially in mid-phrase, not at a cadential situation. So lots of trills that are just decorative mid-phrase. So that's really important because Gaspar Sands is also a Baroque musician. Bach is a very dominant figure in Baroque music, but they're different, and it's a different geographic location, it's a different instrument, it's a different composer. So we need to think about these things so that we know what is flexible and what ideas we can use. And it's not about being like snobby and saying you can't do this or you can do that. It's more about like what ideas do we have? What ideas can we work with? What are the options available to me that I can experiment with? So how do we decide what note to start on? Well, again, like I said before, you want to make sure that you are researching your composer, listening to lots of music so you know what sounds right. And that will go a long way. But also a lot of great books will give you advice. Some music editions will say like whether you can do this or that, or they'll write out possible realizations. But you want to narrow the scope of your inquiry. So for example, here's like an example of narrowing the scope. So we can ask, how did Baroque musicians play trills? But that's pretty broad. So we can go further and say, how did Baroque musicians in Germany play trills? But we can go even more specific. How did keyboard players in Germany play trills? But we can go even further. How did Johann Sebastian Bach play trills on the keyboard? You know, that's a specific question. That's something that you can probably find an answer to, and that isn't just a generalization. We can also ask, how did Gaspar Sands play trills on the Baroque guitar in Spain? So Sands probably did it both ways depending on the musical context. So when you start a new piece, you can ask yourself these questions. What time period is it from? Where's the composer from, like geographically? Who's the composer? You know, like what's their preferences? Who's the composer's influences? What did they listen to? What instrument are they playing and what tuning do they have? What genre or style? Is it sacred music? Is it secular music? Is it vocal? Is it instrumental? What's the form of the piece and the rhythmic feel, the compositional style? What type of notation or tablature did the composer use, and what symbols did they use in the original manuscripts? What do their symbols mean? Do they mean something specific, or are they general? What is the ornamentation style of that composer? Are there any quotations of performance practice from the composer that say anything about it? Are there any articles on, you can just Google it. Are there any articles about it at all? And the list can go on forever. You can ask yourself all these questions and explore. But a lot of us are guilty that we learn one thing, we learn how Bach did it, and then we apply that to everyone as if we know now. Bach did it, so it must apply to all Baroque music. But that's not necessarily true. So let's just do a couple of other things here. Let me play an example here, and I'll do it in different ways so you can hear some different musical effects. So here's the original. This isn't anyone's piece of music. I just like typed out some melodic material, that's all. So no trills in the original example. Add some trills mid-phrase and at the cadence, and I'm going to start from the written note. So the written note will be E in the first case. So So I'll go E, F, E, and then I'm going to go G sharp, A, G sharp at the cadence. So from the written note. I'll do the same thing, but I'll start from the upper auxiliary. So the note above. So I'll be going F, E, F, E, and A, G sharp, A, G sharp. Sounds pretty good. Yep. Here's mixed. In the mid-phrase trill, I'm going to go E, F, E, so starting on the written note. And at the cadential trill, I'm going to go A, G sharp, A, G sharp. I like the mixed version. I'll tell you why. When we play from the written note, it sounds fine. That's nice, very just decorative, doesn't mess things up mid-phrase. That's nice too, it sounds very decorative as well, but doesn't increase the tension of that 5 chord, E going to A. You know, it doesn't help with the function of the music, that tension resolution idea. If we start from the upper auxiliary, I find that in mid-phrase, it was a little bit intense. It kind of put that middle of the phrase into a standstill where there's lots of tension, but the music hadn't ended yet. And so it was fine. It sounded good, but for me, it kind of disrupted the phrase too much and added too much to the music instead of just being decorative. When we mix them, starting from the written note mid-phrase is like very minimal impact on the music. It's just a little fluttering, and then we're past it. But then at that cadence there, that A is a non-chord tone, and then we tension resolution. So we actually, I feel like in the mixed version at the end here, we've actually helped the music accomplish its goals more. Mid-phrase, we weren't too disruptive to the phrase or to the idea of having the phrase continue to the cadence. When we added the upper auxiliary at the cadence, it helped increase the tension and resolution. So in that particular case, if this was sans or something like that, I think that would be very appropriate to play it like that. It makes sense to work with the music as much as you can. But again, you have to really get into this and make decisions. And it's helpful to know lots of music theory, but you don't have to know music theory. You can hear all this stuff, and you can think about it and just think about how it affects you. If you really slow it down and think about it a little bit, you can decide how it actually affects the music yourself. There's other musical situations in music theory that might tell us why one would be appropriate too. Like even in this example, the cadence trill, there's an A right before it. So it kind of serves as a suspension. That A gets suspended into the next strong beat. A to G sharp. So that's a really good music theory justification for using it there. It's very elegant as a suspension. In a lot of later music, in later time periods, maybe the trill starts on the written note, but if there's a suspension involved and a sequence of suspensions, maybe they would start from the upper auxiliary just to include those suspensions because it's a cool musical idea. It's interesting to do that. Again, all based on musical context. So I hope you found that useful. Make sure you check out the full article Because I just talk a lot more. I'm also going to be adding a lot of historical source material there, so you can read about what musicians in the Baroque era or the Renaissance era had to say about trills themselves. So check out that article. It'll be much more informative than this video, and just continue to research your music and get the ideas flowing. That's the main thing. It's not about knowing it all necessarily or doing tons of research, but it's about knowing what options are available to you and just having fun exploring your music.